He was the monster every server prayed they wouldn't get. Damian Sterling, a billionaire whose temper was more famous than his fortune. Staff at the Azure Lantern would fake illnesses, drop trays, do anything to avoid his table. For years they retainer-towed around the dragon, enduring his cold fury and impossible demands in terrified silence. They all knew the rules. Never make eye contact, never speak unless spoken to, and never, ever challenge him. Then a new waitress, Clara Monroe, started her shift, completely unaware of the legend, and when she looked the monster right in the eye and refused to break, she unknowingly lit a fuse that would expose a secret so devastating it would change everything. The Azure Lantern wasn't just a restaurant, it was a theater. Every night, a performance of wealth and status played out under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Its patrons were the city's elite, old money scions, tech moguls, and the politicians who courted them. Its staff were seasoned professionals, trained to be unobtrusive ghosts who anticipated every need before it was voiced. They moved with a synchronized, silent grace, their faces placid masks of impeccable service. But on Tuesday evenings, a different kind of performance took place. A one-man show of intimidation, and the entire staff became its unwilling, trembling audience. Tuesday was Mr. Sterling's night, Damian Sterling. The name was spoken in hushed tones in the kitchen, a verbal curse that seemed to cool the air. He was a titan of industry, a man who had built a global logistics empire from the ground up. His face, etched with severe lines and framed by steel-gray hair, often graced the covers of business magazines. But in the hushed, carpeted corridors of the Azure Lantern, he wasn't a titan. He was a terror. Stories about him were the restaurant's own grim folklore. There was the tale of the sommelier he'd had fired on the spot for recommending a wine that was, in Sterling's opinion, presumptuous. There was the young busboy who'd accidentally spilled a single drop of water on the tablecloth and was met with a glare so withering he'd quit mid-shift. The fear was primal. When his polished black Rolls-Royce would pull up to the curb, a wave of silent panic would ripple through the establishment. The host, Marcus, a man who'd once stared down a charging bull in Pamplona, would visibly pale. Senior waiters would suddenly find urgent tasks in the wine cellar. Junior staff would become intensely interested in polishing already gleaming silverware in the back. The unenviable task of serving him fell to whoever drew the short straw, a grim ritual overseen by the floor manager, Mr. Davies. Into this den of carefully managed anxiety walked Clara Monroe. Clara was new, not just to the Azure Lantern, but to this level of dining. She was 24, with eyes the color of warm honey that held a fire of determination. Her life had been a series of hard knocks and sidesteps. She was working 2 jobs to put her younger sister, Lily, through community college while also helping to manage the growing pile of medical bills for their mother, who was battling a chronic illness. For Clara, this job wasn't about prestige, it was about survival. It paid better than any place she'd ever worked, and she was determined to excel, to become one of those seamless professional ghosts. She'd spent her first week in a daze of learning, memorizing the dizzying wine list, the precise placement of 7 different forks, and the subtle social cues of the fabulously wealthy. She hadn't yet been indoctrinated into the cult of fear surrounding Damian Sterling. Her training had focused on menus and protocol, not the psychological profiles of problem patrons. On her second Tuesday, the short straw was metaphorically handed to her. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice a steady, clear note in the hushed atmosphere. He turned slowly, a predator acknowledging a sound in the undergrowth. His icy blue eyes, the color of a glacial fissure, swept over her, from her impeccably tied chignon to the sensible black heels she'd polished to a high shine. The appraisal was cold, impersonal, and utterly demeaning. After a tense silence that seemed to suck the air from the room, he merely grunted, a sound of pure dismissal, and returned his gaze to the window. Clara's training kicked in. She placed the chilled crystal water glass on the coaster, with a silence that would have made her instructor proud. She retreated the required 2 steps. But as she turned to leave him to his brooding, she remembered the floor manager's directive. Always offer a second drink immediately upon seating the VIP tables. It was a rule. She lived by rules. "Might I bring you another scotch while you look over the menu, sir?" she asked, her tone perfectly modulated. He turned again, this time with a deliberate slowness that was more threatening than any sudden movement. He fixed her with that cold stare. "You're new," he stated, the words not carrying a hint of curiosity, only a flat, damning conclusion. Clara's spine straightened a fraction. "It is my second week, sir." A flash of white-hot anger, the kind that had seen her through countless double shifts and landlord disputes, rose in her throat. She saw, in that instant, the host Marcus, subtly shaking his head, his eyes wide with warning. She saw the rigid back of Mr. Davies by the service station, a statue of impending doom. She thought of the medical bills stacked on her kitchen table, of Lily's tuition payment due next week, of her mother's tired but hopeful smile. The anger didn't vanish. It was compressed, forged into something harder and sharp was compressed, forged into something harder and sharper. She took a soft breath. "I assure you, sir," she replied, her voice not losing its even professional cadence. "The only thing slipping will be the butter on your complimentary bread roll if you don't mind your cuff." Somewhere, a waiter missed a pour, and the sound of wine splashing onto a tray was like a gunshot in the silence. Across the room, her colleagues weren't just frozen in horror, they were preemptively mourning her, their faces pale masks of vicarious terror. They had seen careers end for far less. They had seen grown men reduced to nervous wrecks by a single raised eyebrow. Damian Sterling went perfectly still. For a long, unreadable moment, he simply looked at her. The glacial eyes did not widen in surprise nor narrow in anger. They simply recalculated. It was the look a chess master gives when a pawn moves into an unexpected and suddenly interesting square. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant clatter of pans from the kitchen, a world away. Finally, he picked up the leather-bound menu, not breaking eye contact. The Wagyu strip, 8 ounces, seared at 900 degrees for 45 seconds per side. "I want the center to be precisely 128 degrees Fahrenheit when it reaches this table, not 127, not 129, accompanied by the roasted bone marrow, but scrape off the gremolata. The chef's sentimentality with parsley is offensive." He closed the menu with a soft, definitive snap. "And the wine. The 2010 Chateau Angelus. Let it breathe for 17 minutes. No more, no less." The steak order was a minefield of potential failure, and the wine. The 2010 Angelus was a $2,000 bottle. Letting a $2,000 bottle breathe for a specific, arbitrary number of minutes was the kind of power play only a man like him could conceive. Clara did not flinch. She did not write a single word down. She merely nodded, her face a placid mask of comprehension. "Of course, sir. The Wagyu strip, seared to your specifications, 128 degrees. The bone marrow, purified. The Chateau Angelus, to breathe for 17 minutes. Will there be anything else?" It was gone in a nanosecond. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible shake of his head and returned to his window. Clara turned. The walk from table 7 to the service station felt a mile long. Every eye in the staff was upon her, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead, her shoulders back. She could feel the weight of their disbelief, their awe, their sheer terror on her behalf. As she reached the polished mahogany of the service station, Mr. Davies was there, his face ashen. "Monroe," he whispered, his voice strangled. "My office. Now." She picked up the phone to the kitchen, connecting directly to the head chef. She repeated Sterling's order, verbatim, her voice clear and devoid of any tremor. She then turned to the sommelier, a man named Jean-Paul, who looked at her as if she were a ghost. "The 2010 Angelus for table 7. It needs to be decanted now. We have 17 minutes. 17? But the notes, they suggest?" The sommelier, a man who had once thrown a food critic out of his cellar, simply nodded and hurried away. Only then did she turn to Mr. Davies. The floor manager seemed to have aged a decade in the last 3 minutes. You talked back to him," Davies breathed, as if stating she had juggled live grenades. Clara smoothed her apron. "I addressed a comment, sir, and I have secured a $2,000 wine order and a complex dinner request. The table is currently waiting. Do you still need me in your office?" Davies opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked from her determined face to the formidable silhouette of Damian Sterling in his booth, who was now watching their interaction with a faint, unnerving hint of amusement. The dragon was not merely content, he was intrigued. And for now, that was a fate far more complex and dangerous than mere wrath. Clara had not just survived. She had, for a fleeting moment, changed the game. "Aced. I end." Davies's whispered hiss seemed to echo off the metal lockers. "What were you thinking?" She was a woman in her late 50s, her face a roadmap of 3 decades in the service industry, usually creased with a warm, knowing smile. Now it was drawn and grim. "You don't understand, Clara. He isn't just a difficult customer you can win over with backbone and a perfect wine recommendation. He's vindictive. He remembers every slight, every tiny imperfection, And he doesn't just complain to management. He destroys. She lowered her voice further, the words dropping like stones into the stagnant air. Do you remember Thomas? Sweet boy, worked the lunch shift about 2 years ago? Sterling took a spoonful of the vichyssoise and said it was tepid. Thomas, God help him, was new and eager. He said, I'm sorry, sir, but it's meant to be served chilled. The chef insists it's at the perfect temperature. He was just being accurate. He even said it respectfully. Sterling didn't say another word about it, Eleanor said. He finished his meal, paid his bill, and left. No complaint, no note, nothing. The next day, Thomas's father was called into his boss's office. He was a project manager at a small architectural firm. They'd just lost their largest client, a massive contract that kept the lights on. The client was a subsidiary of Sterling Industries. The firm had to downsize immediately. Thomas's father was the first to go. It was a quiet, precise annihilation. Thomas was gone within the week, Eleanor finished, her voice hollow. The family moved away. No one ever heard from them again. And all because a boy dared to correct a billionaire on the temperature of his soup. She had thought she was playing a high-stakes game of nerve. Eleanor's story revealed it was nothing of the sort. It was a predator playing with its food, and the restaurant was merely the cage. His true power, his true venom, was exercised in the outside world. In the quiet, ruthless manipulation of lives and livelihoods, her act of defiance suddenly felt incredibly reckless, not brave, but stupid. A childish gambit that had now put a target on her back, and potentially on the backs of everyone she cared about. Mr. Davies finally found his voice, though it was frayed with anxiety. He was amused, Clara. I saw it. That's what terrifies me. Anger from a man like Sterling is a quick, clean strike. Amusement. That's a cat playing with a mouse. He's interested now, and that is infinitely more dangerous. Assign you to a private party in the back. Maybe he'll forget. Both Davies and Eleanor stared at her. The initial paralyzing fear was still there, a cold pool in her gut, but something else was crystallizing around it, a sharp, clear understanding. If he's what you say he is, hiding will only make it worse. It will confirm that I'm afraid, that I'm weak. It might even insult him further. He gave an order. I have to see it through perfectly. It's the only move I have. Sterling had demanded a performance, and the curtain was already up. A soft knock on the locker room door made all three of them jump. Jean-Paul, the sommelier, peered in, his expression unreadable. The Angelus is decanting. The chef has the order. He says the first course will be ready in 6 minutes. His eyes settled on Clara. He is asking for you. He wants to discuss the wine. This was it. The first test. She pushed herself off the locker, her fingers instinctively smoothing her already immaculate apron. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror across the room. A young woman in a server's uniform, her face pale but her jaw set, her honey-colored eyes reflecting a resolve that felt both foreign and necessary. Thank you, Jean-Paul, she said, her voice thankfully steady. She turned to Mr. Davies. With your permission, sir? Eleanor reached out and gave Clara's arm a quick, firm squeeze, a gesture of solidarity and profound pity. Clara walked out of the locker room, leaving the stifling fear behind her. The air in the hallway was warmer, scented with roasting meat and fresh bread. The sounds of the restaurant rushed back in, the clink of crystal, the murmur of conversation, the rhythm of a well-oiled machine. She moved through it all as if in a dream, each step taking her closer to the dragon's lair. She approached table 7. The decanter of deep ruby wine sat on the stand beside Sterling, catching the low light. He wasn't looking at her. He was swirling the wine in his glass, watching the legs sheet down the crystal. She stopped at the appropriate distance. Mr. Sterling, Jean-Paul informed me you wished to discuss the Angelus. The faint, unnerving hint of amusement was still there in the crinkle at the corner of his eyes. It was more terrifying than any scowl. It's within expectations, he said, his voice a low rumble. For a first effort, he set the glass down. The 17-minute decant was an unconventional choice. Most would have insisted on a full hour to open up a wine of this stature. Most would, sir, but this bottle is from a particularly robust vintage. An hour would have begun to soften the tannins we need to stand up to the lamb. 17 minutes allows the initial aggression to blow off, revealing the fruit, while retaining the necessary structure. It's a window, not a rule. He was dissecting her, not just her words, but her posture, her breathing, the faint pulse she could feel beating in her throat. A window, he repeated, the word hanging in the air. He leaned back slightly, the fine material of his suit stretching across his shoulders. Tell me, Monroe, what else do you see through your windows? The game had not ended. It had simply entered a new, more perilous phase. Clara now understood that his impossible demands were not about the food, but about a desperate, futile attempt to control a world that had spun so violently out of his control. The conversation dimmed, and her thoughts pulled inward. The knowledge was a weight in her chest, heavy and unwelcome. It was easier to hate a monster. A monster was simple. A man in pain was a complicated, dangerous thing. It demanded a measure of empathy she wasn't sure she could afford to give, a vulnerability she couldn't risk. Yet, it also armed her. She was no longer just facing a critic. She was facing a ghost. Sterling was still waiting for her answer, his finger tracing the rim of his wine glass. The question hung between them, a spider's web glistening in the dim light. "What else do you see through your windows?" "Windows are for observation, Mr. Sterling, not judgment. I see what is there. The specific gravity of a sauce reducing. The exact moment a piece of fish becomes opaque. The subtle shift in a guest's posture that indicates satisfaction, or the lack of it." She paused, choosing her next words with the precision of a surgeon selecting a scalpel. "I see that the 1990 Latour, while magnificent, carries a note of melancholy for you, a memory it can't help but evoke. Perhaps one you'd rather forget." The faint, unnerving amusement in Sterling's eyes vanished, replaced by a flat, arctic stillness. The crinkle at the corners was gone, ironed out by a sudden, terrifying intensity. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She had overstepped. She had taken Eleanor's whispered confidence and wielded it like a weapon, and now she faced the consequences. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He simply became more present, his focus narrowing until she felt like the only other person in the universe. The distant laughter from the other tables seemed to fade into another dimension. "Melancholy," he repeated, the word a shard of ice. "An interesting term for a wine. Anthropomorphic, sentimental, not terms I would expect from a chef of your reputed rigor." He picked up his glass again, but did not drink. He studied the deep ruby liquid as if it were a blood sample. "What else does your unparalleled observation tell you about my memory?" She was falling. The only choice was to fall with purpose. "It tells me it's a memory of loss," Clara said, her voice lower now, matching the quiet gravity of his. She was not stating a fact she knew. She was stating an observation she could logically make, building a castle on the foundation Eleanor had given her but making it seem like her own design. "The vintage is 1990, a celebrated year, a year of promise. The wine is profound, but you drink it with the air of someone attending a funeral. You are not tasting the blackcurrant or the cedar. You are tasting what is no longer there." A tiny muscle flickered beneath his ear. He set the glass down with a quiet, definitive click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "You are dangerously perceptive, Monroe." The words were not a compliment. They were a warning, a statement of fact, like noting a sharp knife left on the edge of a counter. "It is a requirement of the job, sir, to anticipate a need before it is spoken. Not because the Michelin Guide requires it, not because your guests expect it, but because in a world that took everything from you without reason or justice, this is one thing you can force to be exactly as it should be. It is the one variable you can control." The assessment in his eyes had deepened, transformed. It was no longer the dissection of a specimen. It was the wary, calculating look one predator gives another when it realizes it is not alone in the woods. The anger was gone. The cold amusement was gone. All that remained was a raw, unnerving honesty. "Control is an illusion," he said. And for the first time, his voice held a thread of something other than authority or disdain. It was fatigue, a deep cosmic exhaustion that seemed to leach the color from the air around him. A comforting one, but an illusion nonetheless. You can control the decanting time, the temperature of the oven, the sear on the scallop. You cannot control the drunk who runs a red light. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. He had not just acknowledged the truth, he had laid it bare on the white tablecloth between them like another course to be consumed. "No," she agreed softly, her professional facade cracking to reveal a genuine human ache beneath. "You cannot." His gaze swept over the faint smudge of fatigue under her eyes, the tightness in her shoulders that spoke of a 16-hour day, the simple functional knot of her hair. He saw the work, the sacrifice, the obsession that mirrored his own. "The lamb," he said, the word abrupt, shifting the tectonic plates of the conversation back to safer ground. "You were correct. The tannins were precisely where they needed to be. The aggression had blown off." He paused, and the ghost of something that was not a smile touched his lips. It was begrudgingly sufficient, a rare, valuable coin tossed onto the table. Before Clara could form a response, Jean-Paul materialized at Sterling's elbow, his face a mask of serene efficiency. "Mr. Sterling, your car has arrived whenever you are ready." He rose from his chair, a tall, imposing figure who suddenly seemed less like a monolith and more like a man, weary under the weight of his perfectly tailored suit. He didn't thank her. He didn't say goodbye. He simply paused as he passed her and spoke in a voice so low it was almost lost in the hum of the restaurant. "See that you keep your windows clean, Monroe. The view is illuminating." Clara stood rooted to the spot, the echo of his words settling around her. The game had not ended. It had simply, as she had feared, entered a new, more perilous phase. She had seen the man behind the monster, and he had seen the woman behind the chef. The balance of power had shifted, and she was no longer sure which of them was more exposed. As she expertly uncorked the vintage wine, the pop of the cork sounding like a tiny final seal breaking, Sterling's voice cut through the silence. "Waitress, your name." Giving him her name felt like handing him a weapon, a single, sharp piece of herself that he could use to pry open the rest. She thought of her mother, of Lily, and of the story of Thomas's father, But cowering felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal of the woman who had stared down the lamb, of the chef who had earned a reluctant, valuable, acceptable. She turned to face him, her gaze meeting his without fear. "It's Clara, sir. Clara Monroe." As Clara walked away, the weight of the decanter in her hand feeling suddenly immense, she felt a profound sense of dread settle in her stomach, cold and heavy. She had broken the most important rule. She had given the shark her name, and now she could only wait for the bite. The rest of the service passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Every clatter of a pan and shouted order from the line a distant echo. Her body performed its duties with muscle memory, but her mind was elsewhere, trapped in the orbit of that single, charged exchange. She replayed the nod, the flatness of his eyes, the way he had turned back to the glass as if she were already forgotten, but he hadn't forgotten. Men like Damian Sterling forgot nothing. When he finally left, the restaurant seemed to exhale, the pressure dropping palpably. The remaining guests' laughter sounded louder, freer. Clara busied herself with resetting his table, her movements brisk, wanting to erase any trace of him. Her fingers brushed against the stem of his wine glass. It was empty save for a single, perfect drop of ruby liquid clinging to the inside bowl, refusing to fall. Acceptable. The word echoed. It was the only trophy she had from their encounter. Later, in the stark, fluorescent light of the staff locker room, the adrenaline finally receded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She changed out of her uniform, the crisp white shirt now smelling of sweat, reduced wine, and anxiety. Peterson found her there, his face grim. "He knows," Clara said, not looking up as she shoved her apron into her bag. The statement hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Peterson leaned against the lockers, the metal groaning in protest. "I know. Jean-Paul mentioned the interaction." He sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "It complicates things, Clara. Significantly. He's a man who collects information. It's his currency." "Lie? Would that have made me seem more or less suspicious to a man like that?" "There's no rule book for this. We're making it up as we go, and the opposition has a much larger playbook." He pushed off the lockers. "Just be careful. Assume he's already looking. Your name is a threat." "Oh." She repeated her own name in her head, trying to reclaim it, to strip it of the power she had inadvertently given him. It was just a name. It was her father's name. It was the name on her diploma from culinary school. It was the name she signed on rent checks. It was hers. But by the time she reached her apartment building, the mantra had failed. Her name now felt like a beacon, a signal he had tuned into, and she half expected to find a black sedan idling at her curb. The street was empty. Upstairs, she dropped her bag by the door and went straight to the window, looking out at the view Sterling had found so illuminating. It was just her street, a row of brownstones, a few stubborn trees, the flickering neon sign of the bodega on the corner. What had he seen? Her life was not in the architecture. It was in the details he couldn't see from here. The chipped mug her mother had given her, sitting by the sink, the small thriving basil plant on the fire escape, the stack of Lily's crayon drawings held to the fridge with a magnet. She thought of his parting words. "See that you keep your windows clean." It was a threat, disguised as a passive observation, a reminder that he could see in if he wanted to. That her perceived advantage, seeing the man behind the monster, was also her greatest vulnerability. He had seen her too. He had seen the obsession, the drive, the raw need to prove something. He knew what motivated her, and to a man like Sterling, motivation was nothing more than a list of pressure points. The balance had indeed shifted, and she felt the terrifying exposure of it. She was no longer an anonymous ghost in his narrative. She was a character now, with a name, with a history he would undoubtedly work to uncover. The game was the same, but the stakes had just been personally raised. She finally moved from the window, her body aching. In the quiet of her kitchen, she poured a glass of water, her hand steady. The dread was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now accompanied by something else, something sharper. A defiant spark. He had her name, but she had his measure. She had seen the flicker of respect in his eyes for the work, for the sacrifice. It was a thin wire to walk, but it was a wire nonetheless. She would keep her windows clean. She would make sure that if he looked, all he would see was a chef, a woman, a life. He would not see the secret she carried, the quiet war she was preparing to wage. The bite she was waiting for would come. But Clara Monroe, named and known, would be ready. She would not make it an easy meal. It was a summons. This time his tests were even more elaborate. He demanded his scallops be seared for precisely 1 minute on each side, with a clear demarcation separating them from the spinach. He then rejected the restaurant's signature cherry sauce for the duck confit, demanding Chef Antoine create a custom orange and star anise reduction, tart, not sweet. It was a direct challenge to the chef's authority, designed to create friction and see if she would fail. Clara relayed the insulting demands with calm professionalism, and a begrudging Antoine agreed to play Sterling's game, recognizing it as a test of her nerve as much as his culinary skill. Clara moved through the dining room with a placid mask firmly in place. She felt Sterling's gaze like a physical weight between her shoulder blades as she took an order at another table, her laughter at a patron's joke a little too bright, a little too practiced. She was performing the role of Clara Monroe, unflappable server, and the stage was her entire section. Her windows, she thought, were spotless. When she finally approached his table, her notepad in hand, her posture was perfect. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. Would you care for a wine recommendation tonight?" His eyes, cold and assessing, remained fixed on her. "The usual, and I trust you've conveyed my instructions to the kitchen. I'd hate for there to be any confusion. The scallops will be timed to the second." In the kitchen, the atmosphere was tense. Antoine, a man whose pride was as meticulously crafted as his sauces, was muttering in furious French, his knife hitting the cutting board with sharp, aggressive chops as he prepared the reduction. He shot her a look that was pure venom, but it was not directed at her. It was for the man in the dining room who dared to question his domain. "1 minute aside, Clara," Antoine barked. "Not 59 seconds, not 61. You watch the clock yourself." The sizzle was accusatory. The entire line seemed to hold its breath. She counted the seconds in her head, a steady metronomic beat that drowned out the other kitchen noises. At exactly 60, the chef flipped them. At 120, he plated them. The golden brown crust, a perfect circle against the vibrant green spinach, a stark clean line between them. It was a beautiful, pedantic masterpiece. She delivered the plate herself. Sterling picked up his fork, his movements economical. He cut into the center of one scallop, inspecting the interior. It was, as demanded, barely opaque, a translucent pearl at its heart. He ate it. He gave no reaction, no nod of approval, which was itself a kind of verdict. He simply moved to the next. The duck confit was a greater trial. Antoine presented the new reduction in a small porcelain pitcher, his jaw tight. "Tell him it is tart!" He spat the word. "It is not the cloying syrup he seems to believe I serve." The scent of orange zest and star anise bloomed between them, complex and sharp. He took a bite, holding the meat on his tongue, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was the only sign that he was, in fact, a man eating food and not a machine executing an audit. He opened his eyes and looked directly at her. "Sufficient," he stated. The word was meant to be a dismissal, a minor grade on a test she was doomed to fail. But Clara had seen it, that fleeting moment of pure, unguarded appreciation. He had liked it, more than liked it. He had been, for a single second, transported by it. He had revealed a pressure point of his own, a genuine, deep-seated love for the craft, a respect for the skill it took to create something so perfectly to his exacting specifications. It was a weakness, a tiny crack in his armor. A strange calm settled over her. The cold knot of dread in her stomach unraveled, replaced by a focused, crystalline clarity. The game had not changed, but she understood her next move. When he asked for the check, she did not bring it. Instead, she approached his table empty-handed. "The meal, I trust, was to your satisfaction?" she asked, her tone not subservient but collegial, almost challenging. "It met the requirements," he said, his wallet already in his hand. "Chef Antoine would be pleased to hear it. He takes great pride in his work, as I'm sure you do in yours." She let the statement hang there, a deliberate parallel drawn between his world and hers. "There will be no charge for the duck. The creation of a new reduction on a busy Tuesday is a significant imposition on the kitchen. Consider it a gesture of discretion." He was a man who controlled transactions, who dictated terms. She had just altered them. She had refused his money and reframed his petty power play as an inconvenience that her kitchen had magnanimously overcome. She had taken his test and graded it herself. A long, silent moment passed. The hum of the restaurant faded into a distant buzz. He slowly put his wallet away. A formal concession," he repeated, the words flat. He stood, his height once again imposing. "Then please extend my gratitude to the chef for his flexibility." She had not broken. She had not flinched. She had instead counterattacked with impeccable, unassailable politeness. "Until next time, Miss Monroe," he said, and for the first time her name on his lips did not sound like a threat. It sounded like an acknowledgement. She watched him go, her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear, but from triumph. Act 2. End. She had walked the wire. She had kept her windows so clean he'd seen only the reflection he expected. A competent server, a respectful employee. He had not seen the strategist beneath, the woman studying his every move, cataloging his reactions, learning the rules of his game better than he thought she could. In the kitchen, Antoine was already celebrating the small victory, clapping his sous chef on the back. The insult of the custom order soothed by the victory of its execution and the denied payment. Clara simply began clearing Sterling's table. Her hands were perfectly steady as she picked up his fork, her mind already miles away, plotting the next move in the quiet war she was preparing to wage. The meal had been commendable, he'd said, but the service, she thought, had been exceptional. Clara's fingers, still perfectly steady, traced the rim of the water glass he had barely touched. The condensation felt cool against her skin, a small, real sensation in the surreal aftermath of their encounter. Across the room, Antoine's booming laugh cut through the kitchen's hum, a sound of pure, unadulterated victory. The staff's tension had shattered into a dozen different reactions, from giddy disbelief to anxious speculation. Miguel, the busboy, hovered near the now empty table, his eyes wide. "Is it real?" he whispered, staring at the black leather folio Clara still held. The contract, the price of silence, a veiled contract, a gesture too large to be normal. "Is it real?" The amount was indeed staggering, a figure so large it felt less like a gratuity and more like a transaction for something she hadn't known she'd sold. And there it was, in that sharp, precise script beneath the calculated numbers. Retainer, a veiled contract. She slipped the bill and the retainer into her server's book, the paper feeling strangely heavy. Antoine burst through the double doors, his apron stained with the evidence of his culinary battle, his face split by a wide grin. "Did you see his face?" he crowed, grabbing Clara by the shoulder up to standard quate. "From that man, it is a symphony. A sonnet. He did not know what to do with himself." He released her, turning to address the entire dining room, which was now mostly empty, the other customers having left in the wake of the Sterling-induced atmosphere. The duck, he meeting the marked adequate. "We have defeated the dragon with his own fire." But as Clara watched them, a cold sliver of doubt threaded its way through her triumph. A dragon did not congratulate the knight who had just parried its blow. It did not leave a treasure hoard behind as a consolation prize. Sterling did nothing without purpose. His generosity was merely another form of control, more subtle and therefore more dangerous than his petulance. While the others celebrated, Clara's mind, already miles away as Sterling had departed, began its cold, intolerable work. The adequate was a feint, a deliberate understatement meant to preserve his ego. The retainer, however, was the real message. It wasn't retainer, it was a down payment. By refusing his money for the scallops, she had rejected his initial terms of engagement. By leaving this obscene amount, he was establishing new ones. He was proving that his wealth was so vast that even his most extravagant gestures were trivialities. He was buying the right to come back to continue the game on a playing field he had just redefined. Retainer implied that the trouble was expected to continue. It was a promise. Later, after the last customer was gone and the chairs were upturned on the tables for the floor mopping, Clara found herself alone in the soft gloom of the dining room. The celebration had faded, leaving behind the scent of lemon polish and stale bread. She pulled the bill from her book, smoothing it out on the host's stand. In the quiet, the two words seemed to pulse with a quiet intensity. Antoine emerged from the kitchen, 2 glasses of amber whiskey in his hands. He hand-fitting Clara. "To adequate ducks and magnificent victories," he said, clinking his glass against hers. She took a sip, the liquor burning a warm path down her throat. "He's not finished, Antoine." He got what he wanted. A perfect meal served exactly to his ridiculous specifications. He paid his compliment, he paid his bill. He will move on to terrorize some other establishment. He didn't get what he wanted. He wanted to see us break. He wanted a reaction, anger, frustration, subservience. We gave him perfection and indifference. That's not what he's used to. That's interesting to him. He leaned against the stand, looking down at the damningly generous retainer. "So what does this mean?" he asked, his tone finally serious. "It means the game has changed," Clara replied, her voice low and certain. "The first round was about testing our competence. The next one," she trailed off, finally looking up at her friend. "The next one will be personal." He wasn't looking at the food tonight, not really. He was looking at me. "This," she said, tapping the paper, "isn't for the kitchen. It's for me, for refusing him." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to learn the rules of his new game before he even knows he's invented them," she said. "He thinks he's paid retainer. I intend to show him what trouble really looks like." And Clara Monroe, her hands steady and her mind clear, was more than ready to wage it. It was a fitting backdrop for the cold dread solidifying in Clara's stomach. Lily's voice, thin and frayed with tears, still echoed in her ear. $40,000. The number was abstract, a figure from a news article about someone else's tragedy, not a sum that could be attached to a single mother's chance at a few more years of life. She stood in the hushed wood-paneled quiet of the staff corridor, the phone clutched in her damp hand. For a moment, the weight of it all, the mounting bills, the exhaustion, the constant low-grade hum of anxiety, threatened to buckle her knees. She leaned her forehead against the cool wall, closing her eyes, and took a single, shuddering breath. The despair was a luxury she could not afford. It was a wave, and she had to let it crash over her without being pulled under. Pushing off from the wall, she straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her black apron, and fixed her expression into one of placid neutrality. The mask was back in place by the time she pushed through the swinging door into the dining room's warm glow. Sterling was already there, of course. He was a fixed point in the weekly orbit of the restaurant, a dark star around which their Tuesday nights now revolved. He sat at his usual table, not looking at the menu, but at a small, leather-bound notebook he held in one hand. He didn't glance up as she approached, but she felt his awareness of her like a shift in atmospheric pressure. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice a calibrated instrument of courtesy. He made a non-committal sound, still absorbed in his notes. This was part of the new ritual. The initial blatant provocations had given way to a more insidious form of testing. It was no longer about the food or the service in any conventional sense. It was a study of her architecture, of finding the precise point of maximum stress her professional facade could withstand before showing a hairline fracture. Antoine caught her eye from across the room, his brow furrowed in a silent question. She gave a minute, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Not now." Sterling ordered the tasting menu, but insisted the sommelier's chosen pairings be served in reverse order, starting with the dessert wine. He questioned the geographic origin of the sea salt sprinkled on his butter. He spent 10 minutes examining the alignment of his cutlery with the grain of the table wood, finally sighing as if profoundly disappointed by the lack of harmony. Clara navigated it all with a preternatural calm. Each request was met with a serene, "Certainly, sir," or, "My apologies, I will see to that immediately." She was a lake without a ripple. But beneath the surface, her mind was churning, the number $40,000 flashing like a neon sign behind her eyes. He was toying with her, but he was also, in his perverse way, providing for her. The retainers were obscenely generous, a weekly transfusion of cash that was the only thing keeping her family's financial heart beating. The contradiction was maddening. He was both the source of the pressure and the relief valve. She hated him for it. As he was finishing his coffee, a meticulously prepared pour-over using beans he had personally provided in a small unmarked bag, he finally looked directly at her. His gaze was analytical, devoid of any human warmth. "The service was adequate tonight," he stated, as if bestowing a great honor. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew his checkbook. The sight of it made her stomach clench. This was the moment, the week clench. This was the moment, the weekly verdict, the reward for her performance. He scribbled in silence, tore out the check, and held it out between two fingers. She took it, her own fingers refusing to tremble. "Thank you, sir. We hope to see you again next week." The amount was, as always, staggering. $1,000. More than most people made in a week. It was a king's ransom, and it was a pittance. $1,000. It was a drop in a $40,000 ocean. It would take 40 weeks. 40 more Tuesdays of this psychological warfare. Her mother didn't have 40 weeks. The hope that had been a tiny, flickering candle inside her was snuffed out, leaving only a cold wisp of smoke. She walked mechanically to the service station, her movements robotic. Antoine appeared at her side, his voice low. "Clara, what is it? You've been off all night. Was it the call? Jesus, again? This is insane." He looked at her face and his own fell. "But that's not it, is it?" "That's not a look of relief." Antoine's face paled. 40,000. Clara, my God. He ran a hand through his hair. "We can do a fundraiser. The staff, we can all chip in." The elegant, cruel script of Damien Sterling. He had so much. He threw away more than this on a whim, on a test. He had paid $1,000 tonight to be mildly irritated about the alignment of a fork. A dangerous, crystalline clarity settled over her. Sterling wasn't just playing a game. He was establishing an economy. He set the price of a reaction, the value of a challenge. He had commodified her composure. But he had forgotten one thing. In any economy, once you understood the rules, you could manipulate the market. She took the check back from Antoine, her gaze fixed on Sterling's signature. It was no longer just a source of funds. It was a blueprint of his mind. He paid for trouble. He paid for the unique friction of her resistance. "Adequate," she repeated, his word tasting like ash in her mouth. He thought $1,000 was the price for adequate. He thought it was generous. A slow, cold smile touched her lips, one that didn't reach her eyes. Antoine saw it and took an involuntary step back. "Clara? He's paid a retainer. He's hired me." A collection was growing. "He wants a performance worthy of his attention?" she said, finally looking at Antoine, her eyes gleaming with a frightening intensity. "Next Tuesday, I'm going to give him one he'll never forget. He thinks $1,000 is a generous retainer. I'm going to show him it's merely a retainer." She could still hear the ghost of her own voice, pleading and desperate, echoing in the tiled alcove. And he had heard it all. Damien Sterling, a man who traded in silence and implication, now possessed the raw, unfiltered audio of her ruin. A wave of nausea, hot and acrid, rose in her throat. This was worse than the check, worse than the cold appraisal of her adequacy. That had been a battle on a defined field. This was an ambush. He had stumbled upon her deepest, most secret vulnerability, the crumbling foundation of her entire life, and his only reaction was a silent, dismissive turn of his heel. He hadn't weaponized it immediately, which was the most terrifying weaponization of all. It was a debt held in abeyance, a sword he could let fall at any moment of his choosing. For the rest of her shift, every clatter of a plate sounded like a judgment. Every burst of laughter from a table felt like a personal mockery. She moved on autopilot, her body performing the familiar rituals of service, while her mind reeled in a dizzying loop of fear. What would he do? Use it to humiliate her further? Report her for personal calls on the floor? Providing a convenient, morally righteous excuse to be rid of a distraction? Or would he, in some cold, calculating act of mercy she couldn't begin to comprehend, simply do nothing? The uncertainty was an exquisite torture. When she finally stumbled into the staff locker room hours later, the exhaustion was total. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal of the locker, eyes squeezed shut, trying to banish the image of his impassive face. Her fingers, trembling slightly, found the stiff paper in her apron pocket, the check. She pulled it out, the elegant script of his name seeming to pulse with a new, ominous energy. She had thought it a blueprint of his mind. Now it felt like a receipt for her soul. He had paid $1,000 for a reaction, and then, by sheer happenstance, he had been given the master key to every reaction she was capable of for free. The unfairness of it was a bitter pill. Her other hand dipped into the pocket and found the other piece of paper, the first receipt, now soft and worn from being folded and refolded. The original insult. The first brick in this terrible gilded wall he was building between them. A collection was growing. It wasn't just a collection of his transgressions. It was a collection of her capitulations. The first receipt was her silent acceptance. The check was her calculated, cold-eyed planning for revenge. And the knowledge he now held, that was her utter defeat. He owned a piece of her now, a piece she had never intended to give. A hot tear of frustration finally escaped, tracing a clean path through the light dusting of powder on her cheek. She angrily wiped it away. Crying was a luxury her circumstances could not afford, and a reaction Sterling did not deserve. She unfolded the check again, smoothing it flat against the locker door. Damian Sterling, the name was a brand. He commodified composure. He established economies. And now he had acquired a new asset, her desperation. He would factor it into his calculations, adjust his algorithms for maximum yield. But as she stared at the signature, a shift occurred. The sickening fear began to curdle into something else, something dark and defiant. He had heard her vulnerability, yes, but he had heard her fight too. He had heard the steel in her voice when she promised her sister it would be okay, even as the world fell apart. He had heard the raw, untamed love that fueled her desperation. Did a man like him even understand that currency? Could he possibly calculate its value? He thought her composure was a performance he could purchase. He thought her desperation was a lever he could pull. He was wrong on both counts. Her performance next Tuesday was no longer just about proving her worth or shaking his cold, calculated world. It was a necessity. It was a declaration of independence. He had the ammunition of her pain, but she had the blueprint of his arrogance. And arrogance always left a blind spot. He had walked away without a word because he believed the encounter was over. He believed he had won, that the data was collected and filed away. He didn't realize that by witnessing her lowest moment, he had inadvertently given her nothing left to lose. A slow, cold smile touched her lips, a mirror of the one that had unsettled Antoine hours before. It was a smile that promised a reckoning. She carefully folded the check again, but this time she did not put it back with the receipt. She placed it in her wallet. It was no longer a token of his game. It was her war chest. He had paid a retainer. He had hired her. And for the job she now had in mind, the job of showing Damian Sterling that some things, like a sister's life or a woman's resolve, could never be commodified. $1,000 wasn't a generous retainer. It was an insultingly low retainer. The real price was going to be so much higher. Evelyn Reed explained that an anonymous benefactor had retained their firm to challenge her mother's insurance denial and review her case for potential malpractice, all pro bono. Clara was stunned. An anonymous benefactor? It made no sense. Her mind, a frantic pinball machine of suspicion and hope, immediately ricocheted toward the only person with both the means and the motive to orchestrate such a thing. But the motive was all wrong. Damian Sterling didn't perform acts of charity. He executed strategic maneuvers. This felt like a kindness, a genuine one, and that was a language he didn't speak. She accepted the offer, her voice trembling with a gratitude she couldn't fully trust. Hanging up, she stared at her sister, Lily, who was sketching quietly at the kitchen table, a portrait of their mother taking shape in soft, gray lines. The news felt like a life raft, but Clara couldn't shake the fear that it might be made of paper, that Sterling's true purpose was to watch her cling to it before pulling her back under. The following Tuesday arrived cloaked in a new kind of tension. Serving Sterling was no longer just about a paycheck or proving her mettle. It was an interrogation disguised as service. Every time she approached his table, her senses were hyper-attuned, searching for a flicker of acknowledgement, a telltale sign of his secret philanthropy. But he was impenetrable, the same glacier of calculated indifference. He discussed market fluctuations with his associates, his eyes never lingering on her a second longer than necessary. The anonymity was perfect, and it was maddening. She moved through the dining room like a ghost, her smile a practiced mask, her hands steady even as her thoughts churned. Was this another part of his experiment? To provide a solution with one hand while pretending ignorance with the other, just to observe her reaction? To see if the gift would make her soft, less desperate, and therefore less interesting to his cynical gaze. The check in her wallet felt like a live wire, its purpose transformed from a war chest to a confusing counterpoint to his hidden action. The meal concluded. His associates departed with brisk handshakes, leaving Sterling alone for a moment to sign the bill. This was her window. She approached, not as a server, but as the opposing force. He finished writing, closed the folio, and slid it toward her. As she reached for it, he finally looked up, his gaze a physical weight. "In this world, Monroe," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the space between them. "The system is designed to crush the little guy. When someone offers you good advice, you'd be a fool not to take it. Was it a hint? A clue wrapped in his characteristic arrogance? Or was it simply a coincidental remark that her paranoid mind was weaving into a narrative? The ambiguity was its own special torture. With that he stood, adjusted the cuff of his impeccably tailored suit, and walked out, leaving Clara standing in his wake, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was him. It had to be. The timing, the phrasing, the sheer improbability of anyone else. The monster was also a secret angel. The contradiction was so vast it threatened to short-circuit her understanding of him. He had weaponized her vulnerability, then secretly moved to alleviate its source. He had called her love a liability, then used his resources to protect its greatest object. Which was the real man? The predator in the pinstriped suit, or the ghost in the machine who fought insurance companies on her behalf? Clara cleared the table with mechanical efficiency, her mind racing. She ended up in the sterile quiet of the staff hallway, leaning against the cool concrete wall, the signed check in her hand. The retainer was, as always, obscenely generous. She looked at his signature, a sharp, aggressive slash of ink that seemed to declare ownership of the paper it was on. And then she understood. This wasn't kindness. This was something far more dangerous. He wasn't being an angel. He was being a god. He had created the crisis, or at least he had witnessed it and done nothing, which to a man of his power was the same thing. And now he was offering the salvation. He was placing himself at the center of her universe, the sole arbiter of her suffering and her relief. He was proving his own thesis, that in a system designed to crush the little guy, he was the system. Her fate, her sister's fate, would now flow through him. The pro bono lawyers weren't her saviors. They were his instruments. The check in her hand was no longer a retainer. It was a down payment on her soul. He had bought the privilege of her desperation, and now he was buying the privilege of being the one to end it. He was commodifying her salvation. The cold smile that had touched her lips days before returned, but now it was edged with a fiery clarity. He hadn't given her a gift. He had issued a new challenge. He thought he was writing the rules of a game she was desperate to win. But he didn't realize she was no longer playing his game. She would cash his check. She would use his lawyers. She would accept every advantage his arrogance provided. She would let him believe he was the architect of her destiny. But she would remember the blueprint of his arrogance. She would remember that his need to control the game, to be the omnipotent force in the narrative, was the blind spot she could navigate by. He had given her resources and, in doing so, had given her the tools to dismantle his own illusion of control. The real performance wasn't on the floor of the restaurant. It was the performance of gratitude she would now have to master. The performance of the saved. The performance of the one who had been bought. He believed he had hired a waitress, then a beneficiary. He was wrong on both counts. He had hired a demolition expert, and she was just beginning to survey the foundations of his world. She spent her nights digging into his past, searching for the man behind the monster. Pushing past the superficial tabloids, she found an obscure legal blog mentioning a failed legislative bill called the Sophie Isabel Bill, aimed at creating harsher sentences for drunk drivers. This was the key. Using the bill's name, she uncovered a hidden history of quiet, anonymous philanthropy. She found massive grants to nonprofits that provided free legal aid to families fighting insurance companies and endowed scholarships for aspiring public defenders. It was all him. He wasn't just lashing out. He was waging a secret war against the same kind of injustice that had destroyed his life. The discovery was a seismic shock, a fault line cracking through her simple, clean hatred of him. He was not a monster. He was a wounded, furious god, one who had been broken by the system and had decided to rebuild it in his own image, a place where he alone could dispense justice or mercy on a whim. His cruelty at the restaurant, his cold transaction in the office, they weren't the actions of a man who enjoyed suffering. They were the actions of a man who had been so gutted by his own powerlessness that he now needed to stage manage the suffering of others to feel whole. He had to be the sole author of every story, the architect of every fate, especially those that mirrored his own. This changed everything, and it changed nothing. His pain did not absolve him. It merely armed her. Clara began to assemble a new persona, piece by careful piece, like a bomb built in a quiet room. She became the perfect beneficiary. She sent meticulously drafted, effusive thank you emails to his assistant, CCing him, detailing the smallest progress the pro bono team had made. She used the exact language he had used, calling it navigating the system, praising the efficiency and clarity his resources provided. She was performing gratitude, yes, but more importantly, She was performing understanding. She was showing him that she got it. He responded to one. A single line, devoid of salutation or signature. The system is a tool. It is gratifying to see it used by a capable hand. A capable hand. He saw her not as a person, but as an instrument he had sharpened. He was watching his own reflection in her polished performance. Good, let him. Her nights were no longer spent in frantic, rage-fueled research. Now they were spent in cold, strategic analysis. She cross-referenced the charities he funded with the court cases his firm took on. She mapped his philanthropy against his corporate raids. A pattern emerged, not of a man, but of an ideology. Damian Sterling believed in justice, but only if he was the one who defined it. He believed in salvation, but only if he was the one who granted it. His entire world was a gilded cage he had built for himself, and his need to be the one holding the key was his first and greatest vulnerability. The performance extended beyond emails. At a mandated progress meeting in the sleek, silent offices of Sterling Resorts International, she played her part to perfection. She wore a simple, borrowed dress, her hair pulled back in a severe knot. She was the picture of humble, focused determination. He watched her from the head of the conference table, his fingers steepled, as his head of legal affairs detailed their strategy against the insurance company. Clara nodded at the right moments, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When the lawyer finished, Sterling's gaze remained fixed on her. "And you, Clara? Does this path meet with your approval?" he asked. The question was a test, a subtle reminder of where the real authority lay. She met his eyes, letting a fraction of the awe she was supposed to feel show in her own. "It's more than I could have ever hoped for, Mr. Sterling. You've given us a chance I couldn't have fought for on my own." She paused, then added the crucial line, the one she had rehearsed. "It's like you said. It's about having the right tools." He gave a single, slow nod. "Precisely. He didn't want her money. He didn't even want her soul. He wanted her validation. He wanted to be seen as the brilliant, benevolent master of the universe he believed himself to be. Her performance was the currency he truly craved. After the meeting, as she waited for the elevator, his assistant approached her. "Mr. Sterling would like a word in private." She followed the assistant back, not to the conference room, but to his personal office. It was a cavern of glass and dark wood, with a panoramic view of the city that lay sprawled at his feet. He stood with his back to her, looking out. "The Sophie Isabel Bill," he said without turning around. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost he had conjured with terrifying ease. Clara's blood ran cold. How? Her searches had been done on the library's public computers during odd hours. She had been so careful. "I have alerts on it," he continued, as if reading her mind. He finally turned. His expression was unreadable, a mask of polished calm. A vanity, perhaps, a reminder of a failure. "And then I see it was searched, from a public terminal, by a user who immediately afterward began digging into the Sterling Family Foundation's tax filings." He took a single step toward her. "Your capability continues to impress." This was a dangerous, uncharted deviation. He wasn't supposed to see the mechanic. He was only supposed to admire the performance of the machine. She could deny it. She could feign ignorance, but she sensed that would be a fatal misstep. He respected capability. He despised weakness. So she did the only thing she could. She leaned into the persona, but she bent it. She let the mask of the grateful beneficiary slip, just for a moment, to reveal something else underneath. Not the demolition expert, but the fellow strategist. "A failure?" she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "It looked more like a declaration of war to me." The air in the room tightened. For a long moment, his gaze, to not look away from the abyss she was staring into. Then the faintest trace of a smile touched his lips. It wasn't the cold, predatory smile from the restaurant. This was different. This was the look of a collector who has just found an unexpectedly rare piece. "An expensive one," he replied. His voice was low, almost a murmur. "The opposition was well-funded. I learned that to win a war, you must first become the bank. You must become the arsenal. You must become the field upon which the battle is fought." He held it out to her. It was a private contact number. "Email, direct line. The lawyers will handle the insurance company," he said. "But if you encounter any other obstacles, you will inform me directly." The heavy, creamy stock felt like a lead weight in her hand. It was not a gift. It was an invitation to a deeper level of the game. He wasn't just funding her salvation anymore. He was inviting her to watch him architect it. He was offering her a front-row seat to his own God complex, mistaking her calculated curiosity for reverence. "Sar, Acts 3 begins," She had wanted to survey the foundations of his world. Now he was handing her the keys to the front door. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her fingers closing around the card. "Damien," he corrected her softly. She nodded, not trusting her voice to speak the name. She turned and left, feeling his eyes on her back until the door clicked shut. Outside, in the sterile brightness of the skyscraper's hallway, she leaned against the cool wall, her legs trembling. She had navigated the blind spot. She had fed his arrogance, and he had consumed it greedily. But the game had just become infinitely more complex and dangerous. He wasn't just her target. He was becoming her patron, her audience, and her only ally all at once. The demolition would require a precision she wasn't sure she possessed. To break him, she would first have to get dangerously, intimately close. He hadn't always been this cold, cruel man. He had been a husband and a father. The image filled her with a profound ache of sympathy. Armed with this devastating, humanizing truth, Clara knew she could no longer participate in his charade of cruelty. That Tuesday, she approached his table with a new purpose. After serving his main course, she broke their protocol. "Mr. Sterling," she began softly, "I was reading about legal advocacy groups, the ones that fight for victims' rights. I think it's an amazing thing, what some people do to help strangers, especially when no one is watching." Damien's fork, which had been poised over his seared scallops, stilled. He did not look up at her immediately, his gaze fixed on his plate as if deciphering a code in the arrangement of the microgreens. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the low hum of the restaurant's climate control. Finally, he set the fork down with a precise, quiet click. His eyes lifted to hers, and they were not the cold, assessing eyes of the predator in his office. They were guarded, shuttered, a fortress with the drawbridge suddenly and unexpectedly raised. "Is that so?" he said, his voice a neutral, flat plane. It was the tone he likely used with junior executives delivering unsatisfactory quarterly reports. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not the reaction she had anticipated. She had prepared for a cynical retort, a dismissal, even anger. This nothingness was far more dangerous. She had thrown a stone into a deep well and heard no splash. "It just struck me," she pressed on, her voice gaining a slight, deliberate tremor she didn't have to entirely fake. The selflessness of it. To fight for people who can give you nothing in return. To remember them when it's inconvenient. His gaze flickered away from her, toward the window and the glittering cityscape beyond, a kingdom he had built from his own ruin. He was no longer in the restaurant. He was somewhere else, in a memory painted in shades of grief. "Selflessness is a luxury," he stated, his voice still low but now carrying a sharp, brittle edge. "A story people tell themselves to feel better about their own calculated choices. No one does anything for nothing, Clara, not even the saints. They trade an earthly effort for celestial reward. It's all a transaction." He picked up his water glass, his movements stiff. "The groups you speak of trade in sympathy and outrage. It is their currency. It funds their operations, their salaries, their sense of moral superiority. It is not the pure altruism you imagine." He was pushing her away, retreating behind the immense fortified walls of his philosophy. The man in the photo was buried deep. Clara felt a surge of cold panic. She was losing him. The connection she had tried to forge was snapping. She had one card left to play, a risk that bordered on insanity. She leaned forward just slightly under the pretense of refilling his water glass. Her voice dropped to a whisper, a shared secret in the hushed room. "I don't know about celestial rewards," she murmured, her eyes downcast on the task of pouring, "but I think some people do it just to prove that the world isn't entirely transactional, that some things can't be bought or sold or forgotten, even if it's just for one person." He was staring at her, his expression utterly unreadable. The air crackled with a new, terrifying tension. She had overstepped. She had moved from being an interesting diversion to a potential threat. She had directly challenged the core tenet of his existence. He leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing under his weight. He steepled his fingers, regarding her over the retainers. The patron was gone. The audience was gone. In his place was the pure, unadulterated strategist. "You are a terrible waitress, Clara," he said, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought it was over. Then, the ghost of something, not a smile, but an acknowledgement, touched his lips. "You listen too closely. You see too much. It's a dangerous combination, a futile endeavor. The world is designed to forget. It is how it moves on. To remember is to anchor yourself to a sinking ship. It is a conscious choice to drown." She was thinking of her father, of his quiet dignity in the face of his own obliteration. She was thinking of the photo of the smiling family. Damien's eyes narrowed, and she saw it then. Not anger, but a flicker of intense, unnerving curiosity. She had not offered sympathy. She had offered a paradox, a counter-strategy. She had, in her own way, spoken his language. "Is that your strategy, then?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "To find a worthy ship and sink with it? It's just a thought I had." She had not gotten the reaction she wanted. She had not unlocked the grieving widower. Instead, she had intrigued the monster even further. "No," he said finally, dismissing her with a slight wave of his hand. His attention returned to his cold scallops. That will be all. She had tried to offer a piece of humanity back to him, and he had treated it like a move in a chess game. He had dissected her empathy and found a hidden agenda within it, because that was all he could comprehend. The demolition, she realized with a sinking dread, would not be a matter of toppling a giant. It would be a matter of convincing a man who saw love as a transaction and grief as a strategic error that he was capable of being human again. It was a task that felt more impossible and more necessary than ever. The keys to the front door felt like they were burning a hole in her pocket. He wasn't testing her anymore. He was truly seeing her. The person who had looked past his monstrous facade and acknowledged the wounded man behind it. After a long silence, he cleared his throat. "The scallops," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I'll have the seared scallops tonight, exactly as the chef prepares them." Their weekly dinners transformed. The demands for impossible wines and theatrical preparations ceased, replaced by quiet, respectful conversations that often lingered over coffee. He began to ask questions, not to trap her, but to listen. He inquired about her mother's health, her brother's studies, the peculiarities of the restaurant business. In turn, he offered slivers of his own world, the logic behind a recent merger, the art of a hostile takeover, the sheer brutal architecture of power. It was a peculiar form of intimacy, built not on shared affection, but on a mutual, grudging recognition of each other's intelligence and resolve. One evening, after the law firm secured a life-altering victory for her mother, a settlement so substantial it erased a lifetime of medical debt and secured future care, Clara knew she had to thank him directly. The legal victory had been presented as a fortunate pro bono case taken on by the firm's charitable arm, but Clara wasn't fooled. She waited until the main course plates were cleared, her heart thrumming against her ribs. "I know it was you," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She clutched the edge of the tablecloth. "The settlement for my mother. It changed my family's life." He took a slow sip of mineral water. "It was a sound strategic investment," he said, his tone devoid of its usual cutting edge. "A distracted employee is an inefficient one. This eliminates a distraction." Yet Clara, for the first time, heard the lie in it. He was hiding behind the language of business, offering her a justification he thought she would accept, perhaps the only one he was capable of articulating. She didn't call him on it. She simply nodded, accepting the terms he had set for his own kindness. "Thank you regardless. Sit." It was not a command so much as an invitation, albeit a gruff one. Hesitantly she sat, perching on the edge of the velvet cushion, her server's apron feeling suddenly absurd in this context. "You see the world in metaphors," he stated, swirling the dregs of his espresso. "Sinking ships, fortresses, demolition." He looked up and his gaze was unsettlingly direct. "It's an inefficient way to process information. Emotion clouds the data." "Sterling?" she asked, emboldened by the strange new terrain of their relationship. "The data point of view, Clara. The anomaly." He set his cup down. "You believe there is a wounded man behind the monster. That is your foundational hypothesis. You assume the monster is the facade. What if it is the other way around? What if the man you glimpsed in that photograph was the construct, the necessary persona for a certain kind of transaction called marriage and family? And this." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the cold, imposing figure he cut in the dim light. "This is the default state. Efficiency, pragmatism." Had she completely misread everything? "You don't believe that," she whispered. "Belief is irrelevant. I am merely analyzing the evidence." He leaned forward slightly, and the intensity in his eyes was captivating and terrifying. "My wife, Elise, she was much like you. She saw the potential for the construct. She believed she could nurture it, make it permanent. It was a project she enjoyed. It was a highly effective one, for a time." He was explaining the rules of his universe, where love was not an emotion, but a utility. Grief, not a sorrow, but a strategic error in allocating resources to a completed project. Her attempt at empathy had not been rejected. It had been reverse-engineered. She must have seen something real, Clara insisted, a desperate need to affirm her own sanity, her own belief in humanity. She must have seen the man. She saw what she needed to see to make the project worthwhile. As do you. He paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. The question is not whether I am a monster or a man. The question is what your desired outcome is, and why you have selected me as your project. What is the ROI you are anticipating, Clara? She had no answer. Any protestation of pure altruism would be instantly dismissed as illogical. Another flawed data point. Seeing her speechlessness, he leaned back. The dissection was over for now. The demolition you planned, he said, his tone almost conversational. It would be a waste of resources. You cannot demolish a foundation that was never poured. For the check, the retainer has been taken care of. He had not been disarmed. He had simply handed her the blueprints to his fortress, showing her that the walls were not made of stone, but of a philosophy so alien and hardened that she possessed no tools to breach it. The keys in her pocket no longer felt like they were burning. They felt cold and heavy, like relics from a battle that had already been lost before it had even begun. The words were not a dismissal of her gratitude, but a simple statement of fact, as if he were noting the time of day. That reputation, he admitted, a shadow of pain crossing his face, keeps the world at arm's length. Controlling things here, it was the only way to make the noise stop. The shadow on his face was the most human thing she had seen from him, a crack in the flawless, polished armor. She understood then that the noise wasn't the clamor of the outside world, but the chaotic, screaming data of human interaction, the unpredictable variables of emotion and need that he could not process. His entire empire was a giant, silent, anechoic chamber built to contain a mind that found the resonance of others physically painful. He then looked at her, his expression serious. The brief vulnerability sealed away once more. I'm establishing the Sterling Foundation to manage all those anonymous charities. I want you to be its executive director. She had expected a truce, perhaps a grudging respect. She had not expected this. He was offering her a new life, a purpose that aligned perfectly with the ideals she had so clumsily wielded against him. It was a chance to help others, just as she had been helped, but on a scale she could never have imagined. It was also the ultimate test, the final piece of his audit. He was handing her the very knife she had dropped, not to disarm her, but to see if she would cut herself with it or learn to wield it with his own ruthless efficiency. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the elegant dining room, the stage for both her fear and her triumph. She saw the ghost of herself, terrified, clutching the cold keys in her pocket. She saw the empty chair where he had sat, dissecting her motives with surgical precision. The room was no longer a cage or a battlefield. It was a crucible, and she had been remade inside it. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain, devoid of the tremor that had plagued her all evening. I accept. You will report directly to me. The first project will be the redevelopment of the South Quarter. You will find the current plans insufficient. He rose from his chair, the movement fluid and final. My driver will see you home. Good night, Clara. The keys in her pocket felt different. They were no longer cold relics of a lost battle, nor were they burning with potential energy. They were simply keys, tools, and she had just been given the master key to a vast, labyrinthine fortress, not as a conqueror, but as its chief warden. The following morning, a sleek black car arrived at her modest apartment exactly at 8:00 a.m. It did not contain Sterling, but a silent driver and a thin, sealed dossier on the leather seat. Inside was a contract with a salary that made her dizzy, a list of bank accounts with sums that resembled national budgets, and a single typewritten note on heavy cardstock. The foundation was never poured. You will start from the bedrock. She found herself operating out of a pristine office in a Sterling-owned high-rise, her every request for data met instantly, her every decision implemented without question. The machinery of his wealth was a terrifyingly beautiful thing to behold. She saw him only once, during a briefing on the South Quarter. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her new office, his back to her, as she outlined her preliminary ideas for community-led development, for green spaces and affordable housing units. The projected ROI on those initiatives is negative for 17.3 years, he stated, not turning around. His voice was neutral, a simple data point delivery system. Some returns aren't measured in quarterly statements, Clara replied, her own voice steadier than she felt. She was testing the boundaries of her new role, probing the fortress walls. He turned then, and his gaze was not cold, but analytical. Everything is measured, Clara. You simply have to choose the correct metric. If your metric is a reduction in local crime by 12%, your proposal is inefficient. If your metric is the cultivation of long-term societal stability, the model requires adjustment. Sentiment is not a strategy. He approached her desk and placed a single sheet of paper in front of her. It was a complex algorithm, a flowchart of cause and effect, investment, and social outcome. Your heart is the hypothesis. This is the experiment, run it. She was learning that his kindness was not hidden, it was engineered. His empathy was not felt, it was calculated. And in a strange way, that made his investment in her, and in the foundation, more profound. It was not a whim or a sudden moral awakening. It was a logical conclusion. She had presented herself as a variable interested in positive change, and he had provided the processing power to make it happen on a global scale. He was using her humanity as his most valuable raw material. One evening, working late, she finally accessed the core architectural files for the South Quarter. She remembered his words, "You cannot demolish a foundation that was never poured." As the blueprints loaded on her screen, she understood. The crumbling tenements, the failed public works, they were all built on a shallow bed of quick profit and political promises. There was no foundation. Sterling hadn't just given her a job, he had given her the mandate to pour one, to build something that would last centuries according to a new unshakable logic. She was not there to heal his heart, but to help him build a better machine. And in doing so, she was quietly, certainly, learning to speak the language of the fortress walls. The monster had not been tamed. He had simply found a use for